From 1950s onwards, the apartheid state's reach and power grew through legislation aimed at racial discrimination, separation, and social engineering. So universities like the UFS would enter into significant phases of their development and later for their own reckoning. Critical for us to understand is that universities, like governments, for example, have ideas that not all citizens or employees support. However, unlike what we are witnessing now, in that time and space, the governing ideas were the ruling ideas, with Afrikaans universities identified for the training and development of personnel for the apartheid government, for Afrikaans business interests in the private sector, and for the cultural development of the Afrikaner nation. So emphasis was placed on the development of these campuses. We see this symbolically in terms of how campus infrastructure and its policies developed over the period the 1950s up until the 1990s. In 1958, the Faculty of Agriculture was established. In the same year, the biology building was built. In 1959, P.W.G. Groenewald, or better known as Flippy, becomes the 7th rector. As the commander of the Koffsie Tempi Brigade, he also acquires further land for the university and starts planning for the medical faculty. In 1960, the psychology building is established. In the same year, the Sharpeville massacre takes place, catapulting the unjust legislation and discriminatory practices of the apartheid government into sharp global focus. Afrikaans universities, however, largely seem abstracted from these events and their repercussions. In 1960, the Dutch Reformed Church Synod asked the university to repeal the Conscience Clause. This clause, dating from 1916, stipulates that religious affiliation may not be a prerequisite for enrollment as a student, for permission to graduate, for appointment as a lecturer, or for the election of any office or for the entitlement to any privilege. However, on the 4th of December 1961, and with a majority of 2 votes, the Senate decides to retain the clause. This meant that appointments, privileges, and graduation rights could not be determined by the person's religious affiliation, a process which was taking place in other institutions across South Africa at that time as the influence of the Dutch Reformed Church in its politics and society grew. In 1961, South Africa finally declared a republic after having left the British Commonwealth in 1960. Celebrations across the country by its white Afrikaans citizens takes place. In 1962, the D.F. Malherbe Hostel for male students is established. Today, we know this as Villa Brovado. In 1963, Emily Hobhouse is built as the Agriculture Building. In 1965, the building we know today as housing the Theology Faculty is established and used first for university administration purposes, then for the Education Faculty, and only thereafter for the Theology Faculty. In 1966, the Odeon and the West Block of the main building are established. In 1967, Benedictus Kok, the 8th rector, is appointed, and the second growth phase of the university takes place with a plethora of new buildings, hostels, sports facilities, and new roads being built on campus. Kok sets his tenure as one in which students' numbers would increase, the quality of academic training would improve, the university would assist in shaping the character of students and inculcating them a love for culture. By this time, South Africa was positioning itself as one of the strongest countries in the world economically, with the apartheid government subsequently providing further support for its institutions, such as those of universities, as Afrikaans businesses would also do. Land for the Western Campus over this period of time is also acquired and given continuous expansion needs of the university. In 1968 and 1969, 2 new male residences are built, being the H.F. Verwoerd Hostel and the C.R. de Wet Hostel. Today we know one of them as Armentum, and the C.R. de Wet Hostel remains under its name, but used for administrative purposes. In 1969, the Faculty of Medicine is established at the university. In the same year, Alida Lutz is appointed as the first female professor, and a full-time sports administrator is appointed, indicative of the growth of the university and its understood influence on the development of Afrikaner women, as well as its reach into the sporting arena. In 1970, the C.R. Swart building is established to house the law faculty, and the Steph Coetzee building is established to house research institutions and later offices for the Faculty of Law. Various residences are also built at this time, including N.J. van der Merwe in 1970, Haus Marelief in 1971. Marula is also built in 1971, first as a kitchen, then later converted into a residence. In 1972, Haus Vergeetmenie is built, followed by Haus Kippersol and Valvicha in 1973. Karia and Soetdoorn are built in 1974, followed by Haus JBM Herzog, Kyalami, Haus Vagebiki in 1975. In 1976, Haus Acacia and Haus Roosmarijn are built. Over the period of 1972 to 1973, the George de Dooit building is established as the administration of the university expands, given the ever-increasing student numbers. From 1972 to 1976, the Francois Retief buildings are established to house the medical faculty. In 1975, the Kali Human Hall is established, named after the deceased son of one of the most prominent fundraisers for the university from the 1950s onwards, Bernie Human. In 1976, the 9th rector, Wynand Mouton, is appointed. He is a nuclear scientist and brings focus to the necessity of scientific research in a university. Over 19 new departments are established during his tenure, showing the radical expansion the university would make in terms of the academic project. In the same year of his appointment, the Soweto uprisings take place, with school-going learners and youths protesting, among others, against the Afrikaans education system imposed upon them in schools by the apartheid government. On the 9th of June 1978, and despite the growing global scrutiny of the National Party and apartheid following the Soweto uprisings, the university decides to repeal the Conscience Clause, stating that future appointments would supposedly be only made on merit and in the interests of the university. A policy document is developed which foregrounds that the university has a foundation in Christianity and in Afrikaans, inferring that its character of Afrikaner nationalism would continue. In 1980, the Faculty of Theology is established. Over the period of 1980 to 1983, the UFS Sasol Library Complex is established as the university expands academically, and in 1983, the Wynand Mouton Theatre is built as Afrikaans culture continues to grow. In 1984, in a break from past beliefs of total racial separation and exclusion, black students for the first time are allowed to register for master's and PhD theses through the university, as long as they do not stay on campus and do not interact much with other students. In 1985, FAMOFS is founded. In 1986, the university has its first so-called colored graduates and Shimla Park is established. In 1988, and under political pressure, the first black undergraduates are allowed to register at the university, although they are not yet allowed to live in the residences. In 1989, the 10th rector, Francois Retief, is appointed and the transformation of the university begins in line with the broader political changes taking place in South Africa. From 1990, the UFS declares itself as being open to all races, and some of the first black students are allowed to live in the hostels on campus. In 1993, the university adopts a dual language system of English and Afrikaans again, to cater for the growing number of black students now attending the university. In 1994, South Africa becomes a constitutional democracy, and by 1997, with the publication of the Higher Education Transformation Act, institutions like those of the UFS will now have to address and change the nationalism, inequalities, and exclusions it had previously operated under. Part of this long-term process of transformation from 1997 to date includes all public universities have to adopt non-racist, non-sexist, social justice, and human rights-centered principles and practices. Access to and support within the institution is not allowed to be based on principles of discrimination, nor on discriminatory practices. Over the period of the late 1800s up until the mid-1900s, the Afrikaner nationalists would fight for their recognition as a nation equal to, if not superior to that of the British, not supporting the post-war agreements on conciliation, given the destruction which the British had employed upon the Afrikaner. From the mid-1900s onward, universities like the UFS would become important vehicles that would continue the fight for recognition and for the development of the Afrikaner nation and its state. However, similar to most struggles based on individualized or dislocated senses of injustice and nationalism. This fight would more often than not result in even more injustice and harm being done. These are the issues which we today have to continuously be aware of and to continue to grapple with examples not only from the past, but also from what is happening around us now. From 1996, the South African government and the various organizations and institutions involved in the struggle for our democratic freedom have promoted the concept of nation building as opposed to the notion of nationalism. We are still grappling with what nation building means in our current time and space. We should also reflect on why the concept of nationalism is rejected, with the best examples for us to reflect on would be that of the 20th century.